The Houston Texans had a crazy first round of the draft. Everyone knew that the Texans wanted a franchise quarterback, but the question was if they loved someone other than Bryce Young, who went first to the Panthers. Well, Houston got on the clock at 2 and selected CJ Stroud, but they weren't done. Houston traded up to the 3rd pick to take Will Anderson. The Texans had 2 of the top 3 picks in the draft and came out with a top quarterback and maybe the most talented player in the class. The Texans should be ecstatic, and their future may finally be headed in the right direction, and the biggest reason why is CJ Stroud. CJ Stroud took over as the starter for Ohio State in 2021. He led the Buckeyes to a 10-2 record before winning the Rose Bowl. And in that game versus Utah, he set Rose Bowl records with 573 yards and 6 touchdowns. Stroud was just good all season long. He was first-team All-Big Ten and a third-team All-American after throwing for 4,400 yards and 44 touchdowns to 6 interceptions while completing 71.9% of his passes. Ohio State started last season 11-0, and they were the number 2 team in the country, but the wheels fell off. In their final regular season game, Ohio State lost to rival Michigan for the 2nd straight year, and it cost them a spot in the Big Ten championship. Now, the Buckeyes still made the college football playoff, but lost to Georgia in the semifinals in a game where Stroud was fantastic. He had 348 yards and 4 touchdowns. Stroud finished his redshirt sophomore year with 3,300 yards and 37 touchdowns to 6 interceptions while completing 66.2% of his throws. CJ Stroud was really fun at Ohio State. I think it's always going to be a shock looking back that he went 0-2 against Michigan. He did have stacked weapons. In 2021, he had Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jackson Smith-Njigba. The pieces were set for him to succeed, but he still exceeded expectations. Stroud had a great 2-year stretch starting in college. He was good, just like he was in high school. Stroud played at Rancho Cucamonga High School in California. His senior season, he passed for 3,800 yards and 47 touchdowns. He was also the MVP of Elite 11 in 2019. Stroud was considered a 4-star recruit and the 2nd best pro-style quarterback in the class. He committed to play at Ohio State, where he spent his freshman year redshirting as the backup to Justin Fields. Stroud only took 1 snap and he ended up scoring a 48-yard rushing touchdown. Funny enough, that is the only rushing touchdown of his college career. He isn't a crazy running threat, but he's good enough with his arm to make up for it. The Texans owned the 2nd overall pick at the draft after a truly horrendous season. Originally, the 1st pick was the Bears. There was certainly the chance Chicago could keep the pick, and Houston would have their choice of whichever quarterback they preferred. There's a good shot the Texans wanted Bryce Young, but after the Panthers traded up, Houston was going to have to take whoever was left on the board. The reality is, if Houston wanted to make sure they could get whichever quarterback they wanted, they would have had to trade for one, but that may have not been worth the capital the Bears wanted. It sounded like the Texans were considering foregoing a quarterback and taking a defensive guy. Well, Houston did both. The Texans traded back up to get the 3rd pick in the draft from the Cardinals. The Texans had another first, the 12th overall selection. They traded that, the 33rd pick in the draft, and a 1st and 3rd next season. That's a lot to give up, but it allowed Houston to take arguably the best defensive player in the draft, Will Anderson. In each of his last 2 seasons at Alabama, Will Anderson was the SEC Defensive Player of the Year and a unanimous All-American. As a sophomore, he had a nation-leading 17.5 sacks and 31 tackles for loss. Then last season, Anderson recorded 10 sacks and 17 tackles for loss. He was always that guy that stood out when you watched Alabama. Anderson always looked like he was the best player on the field, and if it weren't for a few good quarterbacks in this year's draft class, he would have gone 1. Will Anderson was truly dominant in his 3 years in Tuscaloosa, and that was always expected to be the case. Anderson went to Dutchtown High School in Hampton, Georgia. His senior year, Anderson had 22 sacks and 15 tackles for loss. He was a 5-star recruit, the top weak side defensive end in the country, and the 17th best prospect overall. Anderson was the starting outside linebacker for the Crimson Tide as a freshman. He recorded 7 sacks and 10.5 tackles for loss en route to being named second team All-SEC. It sounds crazy, but that literally ended up being his worst season in college. He was a dog, and he is going to help the Texans pass rush a ton. The Texans have a lot of holes on their roster. The standout on the offense last season was Dameon Pierce, a 4th-round rookie. He ended up rushing for 900 yards and 4 touchdowns. He'll at least be a reliable, familiar face this upcoming season. Brandon Cooks was the Texans' #1 wide receiver in 2022, but Houston decided to trade him to Dallas for a 2023 5th and a 2024 6th. Houston tried to fill that hole by giving Robert Woods a 2-year, $15.25 million contract. He's had 2 1,000-yard seasons in his 10-year career and was really good in Los Angeles a few years ago. Woods has been good at times, but he looked really ugly in Tennessee last year. It isn't pretty, but the Texans' top returning wide receiver is Nico Collins. He's entering his 3rd season in the league and has recorded about 400 yards each season. What will be worth watching is the health of John Mechie. Houston took him in the 2nd round last year, but he was diagnosed with leukemia in July and missed the entire season. The Texans have posted some pictures on social media that show John Mechie on the practice field for offseason workouts. Forget football, it is so good to see him back. Not only is it going to make a remarkable story, but the Texans could use the receiver help. Houston kind of made a splash at tight end by signing Dalton Schultz to a 1-year, $6.25 million deal. He spent the first 5 years of his career in Dallas and has had over 500 yards in each of the last 3 seasons. I think Schultz was really good for the Cowboys personally. On the offensive line, the gas man himself, Laramie Tunsil, is the real deal. He's one of the best pass blockers in football, but the rest of the line is pretty bad. It's going to be harder for a young quarterback to develop with that line. It's hard to watch. That's probably the single biggest thing that the Texans need to fix. Houston also does still have Davis Mills, who has been the starter for the last 2 seasons at quarterback, but the Texans also signed Case Keenum to a 2-year, $6.25 million contract. He's a seasoned veteran who could certainly help a young guy develop. I don't know why you need both Mills and Keenum, but it'll be interesting to see who is the actual backup come week 1. Just like the offense, the Texans defense is pretty bad too. Last year, it felt like offenses could really do whatever they wanted to Houston. Luckily, there are some reasons to be optimistic. The defensive line was actually better last season than expected, and that really came from Jerry Hughes. He had a long, successful tenure in Buffalo, and it carried over to Houston with 9 sacks and 10 tackles for loss in his first season with the team. Linebacker is really ugly, but the secondary at least has some promise. Derek Stingley had a lingering hamstring injury last season and only played in 9 games, but he could legitimately turn into one of the best corners in the league. The Texans took him 3rd overall last year for a reason. They also drafted Jalen Petrie in the 2nd round. He ended up having a good rookie season with 147 tackles and 5 interceptions. The Texans also signed Jimmy Ward to a 2-year, $13 million contract. He last played in San Francisco, so he already has a familiarity with the Texans' new head coach, DeMeco Ryans. The Texans have their 4th different head coach in 4 years in DeMeco Ryans. Bill O'Brien was the head coach for Houston for about 7 seasons before he was fired during the 2020 season. David Culley was hired and fired after a single year. Last year, Lovie Smith had the same fate. Now, DeMeco Ryans steps in. He's already a fan favorite. Ryans was a Texans 2nd-round pick in 2006 and played in Houston for 6 seasons. His last season playing in the league was 2015. He decided to get into coaching and was great for 6 years for the 49ers. Yes, I know this is a lot of 6s. He was San Francisco's defensive coordinator for the past 2 seasons. As a defensive-minded head coach, his offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick, is going to play a major role in the development of CJ Stroud. He was most recently the offensive passing game coordinator for the 49ers. players. The Texans aren't going to be good next season. It's going to take some time to rebuild and fix this thing, but that's okay. I think DeMeco Ryans is going to be a good guy to right the ship, and he should have a much longer leash than David Culley and Lovie Smith did. At the very least, he's going to help that defense a lot. When it comes to the offense, the Texans need to make sure CJ Stroud has the right pieces around him so he can develop and turn into an elite quarterback. I know there are a lot of worries about CJ Stroud, and some of them are fair, but after watching him at Ohio State closely, I think he has the tools to be good if the Texans can put him in the right situation and help him learn.